in any case, in the Christian view of things, everything is coming from God, and it's His virtues, especially the virtues mediated through the life, suffering and death and resurrection of Christ, that is the source of true virtue. And this is what begins to be infused into us as fast as our attachment to the false self-system diminishes or is dismantled. So our work is really the dismantling of the obstacles in us that prevents the free flow of this genuine energy that is trying to transform us and flood us with the maximum degree of divine life that we can possibly receive. And if necessary, God will enlarge your capacity so you can receive more. This is the project that is revealed to us in Paul when he speaks about the mystery which has been hidden from all ages in Christ, which is our union with Him. In any case, we're speaking here of what happens when the sacred word, over a long period of time of daily practice, reduces our ordinary flow of thoughts to some degree of silence and manageability. This means that we're spending more time, and the habit of doing this increases the time, at the depths of the river of our being instead of on the surface level of our consciousness. Using another image, the sacred word is like opening your hand to let go of something. That's its purpose, to let go of every thought. So it's just a reminder of that attitude of letting go. When that attitude has been thoroughly developed, so that one has a habit of letting go rather promptly of every thought, impression, perception that comes down the screen of consciousness, then you enter into what that 14th century mystic called the cloud of unknowing. Each time one lets go of a particular thought, one is developing the habit of not knowing that thought, not getting involved in it. Hence, you begin to develop the capacity to stand back, to disidentify with your ordinary flow of thoughts, and that gives you a chance to change. And what is more important, not just an abstract conviction that you can change, but the existential experience which is necessary for damaged emotions, which is that you feel like changing. Because now you know you're not dependent on that thought. You not only go on living, but you're a hell of a lot happier if you are not locked in to every blasted thought that comes down the stream of consciousness that you have to process in some way and feel something about, and then analyze your feelings, and then deal with the tapes that tend to develop in the unconscious and go off along with feelings. Feelings and the commentary. This is our normal psychological life, is filled with that melodrama, maybe 50, 60, 100 times a day. This is what Christ is trying to liberate us from. That's no life. That's death. That's misery. The true life is to decide what you're going to do, not be compulsively pushed into this emotional reaction and to that feeling of being abused, or every time somebody looks at you without the maximum of approval, or whatever your program for happiness or to avoid unhappiness might be. So as we develop the habit of letting go, we begin to know God no longer through concepts, but through this mysterious, undifferentiated presence that is developing proportionately as we learn how to let go of every concept. This doesn't mean there's anything wrong with these concepts. It just means that we're so over-identified that we got to have a discipline of letting go in order to become normal. And normality consists in balance, not being stuck on any one way of responding to reality. So the sacred word now is just an arrow pointing where we want to go. It's not a means of getting there. This is a way that differentiates it again from certain concentrative methods in which the repetition of a word of itself calms the mind. The faculty that is relating to God here is our will, our consent to God's presence. And this is what the sacred word is renewing again and again. Remember that story about the two old folks sitting on the porch? Well, once in a while an airplane goes overhead, and they're distracted a moment, then they go back to looking at the sunset and holding hands, or maybe if they are holding hands, one will the other will give a little squeeze just to indicate their apologies for having been distracted by that airplane. And they return to their original intention to share their mutual presence together and enjoy it. Enjoy each other. That's all you're doing. That is being developed in the centering prayer practice. The capacity to linger in the presence of God and like it. And this is an acquired taste given our present situation. So that one is constantly going to be attracted again and again by some flashy boat that comes down the screen of consciousness and takes our attention away from the sacred word. Now we want to get on that boat to see what's in the hold, and as soon as we do, we're stuck and we go downstream and lose our poise and our and the depth of our interview with God. What do you do then? You get off the boat and start over. There's going to be an enormous amount of starting over. Because remember, we're just learning how to do this thing, and we will keep getting on the wrong boats again and again. But with practice and realizing how distressing it is to lose touch with that delightful presence when it's the object of your focus, interior focus, you begin to learn how to let go promptly, more and more promptly, of the attraction towards those thoughts. For instance, when we're quiet, when the mind is quiet, and our little boat here, which we've sailed, so to speak, on the surface of our mind in the imagination, very gently floating it, almost like a child floating a paper boat in the bathtub, and the thoughts are spreading out and then disappearing, and then our mind begins to move slowly and is attracted towards the interior peace, silence, mysterious quiet. There's no word to describe it because it's beyond words, images, and concepts. It's a sense of God's presence or of peace, or there's any number of ways in which this spiritual experiences impresses itself upon us. And then while we're enjoying this in some degree, along comes some flashy boat that appeals to our emotions or our curiosity. Now, whenever that happens, you immediately experience a sticky sensation. And that you can't quite let go of it. You'd like to get rid of it, but there's a certain fascination. And some negative thoughts are this way. Even though we know they're going to be painful, we can't let them go. Certain self-destructive tendencies in us that like to look at things that make us miserable. I don't know why, but that's the way it is. So anyway, when that happens, then by returning to the sacred word, our attention, which doesn't always mean to say it explicitly or in an articulated way, if one is in a fairly deep place, you don't have to return all the way to the surface of your consciousness in order to open your hand and let go of that flashy boat. Just the memory of the sacred word or the beginning of a movement towards the sacred word is often enough to be able to allow the attractiveness of interior silence to take over again and restore that presence, that watching the sunset together, that holding hands, that resting in God's lap, that embrace, that interpenetration of spirits, however you might in general conceive it, although during prayer is not the time to conceive of anything or reflect of anything. So in choosing a sacred word, it's important not to choose one that sets off your memory bank by the association of ideas. Whether it is a sacred word in itself or not, like the holy name, it's in this context, it is being used primarily as a pointer as to where you want to go and as a reaffirmation of one's original intention of spending this heavy date, this interview, this encounter, this sharing of presences with God during the parameters of this particular time. Now, there's another psychological apparatus that I think deserves attention in order to understand the full teaching about the use of the centering prayer, and it appears in this humble diagram here. There is something in the human brain research moving so fast I can't affirm that they still hold this, but there's some little gland at the base of the brain which acts as a kind of receptionist. That is to say, it regulates what particular moment of consciousness you have. And this is affected, of course, naturally by the fact that all the bodily processes don't really come to consciousness, although they're being recorded in the memory bank of the brain. Absolutely every experience is. So we're not recording consciously our blood pressure at this moment, our white blood count, our digestive system. Usually you don't even think of it unless you're ill or something. We also control our awareness, or each moment of awareness, which is the tip of an enormous iceberg, by our repressive apparatus, which does not want to think of certain things that are painful. That's part of one of the defense mechanisms. It also doesn't want to sometimes think of some new idea because we're wedded to for various selfish reasons, to a certain way of doing things. And like the apostles, when Jesus told them about his death, they didn't want to hear it, so it just didn't come to their awareness. The scripture says their minds were a perfect blank. A perfect description of the power of this receptionist to black out reality if you don't want to perceive it. So also the will and the reason can give certain instructions to the receptionist not to think of certain things today, or to think of certain particular things, such as you're now paying attention to my conference, and this was ordered by your executive faculties of reason and will, and the receptionist noted that in her little journal, and so you're giving me your complete attention, okay, hopefully. Now here she is, the receptionist. So 2 flower pots, and like a receptionist at a dental office or something, the receptionist determines who comes in to the office of the doctor. So the receptionist in the brain determines what clients, what impressions normally come to our awareness. Now here's the chief executive, here's the receptionist. Now in centering prayer, here's what happens. We send the receptionist out for a coffee break. We send the receptionist out for a coffee break. That is to say, we adopt a totally receptive apparatus approach. Now what happens? All the clients that have been clamoring for an appointment with our awareness since we were born are lined up at the door. When they see there's nobody to prevent them from rushing in, they say, oh boy, our chance has come. And they all come charging into our awareness, and as we're sitting there, supposedly in the lap of interior repose and silence, this incredible barrage of thoughts comes in that makes us think we're looking at a not just a double feature, but 4 movies going together on the same screen at the same time. It's all just a horrible jumble. And then a few dreadful creatures come in, a few memories from early childhood, etc., terrible terrors or something, and they come charging in, and they're banging on this door, and they tear it down, and they come rushing into our awareness. We're totally unprotected and vulnerable. But, da-da-da-da-da-da, there's a trap door in this office. Here it is, trap door. And so, if you're practicing centering prayer, you're not on that level. You drop through the trap door into the office below. And the door closes, and when they come in, they can't find you. They're looking everywhere, under the chairs and under the rug, behind the curtains. Where is he? Where is he? And you hear them charging around upstairs, and this background noise. But you're completely free because your attention is here in pure faith at the spiritual level, and they don't know how to get down there. All these thoughts are on this level. They have no way down. There's no stairs, no elevator. This is the limit of their... So this is what the sacred word enables us to do. We push the button, so to speak, on the trap door by returning to the sacred word. We go down to this deeper level of attention. Whenever we're tempted to come upstairs because of the din to see what the heck they're doing to our office, we just return to the sacred word, and then when our time is over, we quietly go upstairs, replace the receptionist. She's finished her coffee break. It's only 20 minutes after all. And now life resumes, but with a whole new perspective, a great deal of peace, so that now we can actually handle a few of the more distressing clients when they come in without being upset. We don't need to purge them anymore. And so our capacity to relate to God, ourselves, and reality is constantly increasing day by day without even thinking about it, because we're disidentifying with the interior dialogue, the false self-system, and experiencing inwardly a spontaneous desire to change because we were made free, and you can't help but enjoying it if you get any touch of true interior freedom. Every movement, although it's a little tight in the beginning, out of some compulsion or addiction or attachment, they're all about the same thing, is becoming more human, more reasonable, more faith-filled, more united to God, more able to decide as a human being what to do and how to respond to life, rather than be pushed around by life events, our own thoughts, our own programs for happiness that can't possibly work. That's the rationale, you might say, behind the sacred word. Again, there seems to be also in the spiritual life certain teaching about temptation, and a certain personification of evil in the person of Satan. We come across this in the gospel. You find it in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. You certainly find it, I think, everywhere in all the traditions, more or less, with slightly different explanations. The chief activity of this malignant power, which seems to have some kind of capacity to make more trouble for us than we already have provided for ourselves. Chief activity of temptation, and we will go into that later when we observe a paradigm of the spiritual journey in the Christian life, and which is conceptualized precisely with the background of various levels of temptation rather than levels of consciousness. Different ways of presenting the spiritual journey, and they all sort of enlarge your view of it and are enriching. But anyway, the temptation then is simply activates those vulnerable areas that are most tender. And it's hard to attribute that to ourselves all the time. Most of the time it is ourselves and various unconscious forces that we're perhaps projecting on a malignant spirit because we're not prepared to blame ourselves, which is the true cause yet. But as one grows in humility, even after one is humble enough to recognize that most of our emotional problems are not somebody else's fault, but are our own problem because of our attachments to some emotional program that's constantly being frustrated. Even after that, there still is at times a certain urgency or force or length of time to certain temptations that suggest that some evil power has some capacity, at least, to stir up trouble or to make our normal problems worse than they are already. So those are three factors that sometimes arise, three psychological factors in the spiritual journey, namely the receptionist, the repressive apparatus, and the temptor. And none of them can really do us any harm if we are practicing faithfully our prayer. And in actual fact, all those factors, insofar as they are deleterious, are weakening day after day as one learns to enter into the cloud of unknowing when one goes into one's prayer, which enables one to know God in a wholly new way. And so just as particular drops of water in the atmosphere eventually coagulate to form a cloud, so the gentle but repeated and patient waiting upon God, renewing one's and affirming one's intention to be with Him in His presence at this deep level of faith, is gradually enabling us to remain permanently or go quickly to that place of rest when we begin our period of prayer. And contemplative prayer then begins a certain development of its own that may go on in the next life, for all we know, or forever. In any case, it's totally orientated to an ever-deepening unity and union with God, with the ultimate reality, with the whole cosmos, everything that is, as more and more of one's own subjective experience. I'd like to conclude today with this little story about letting go. Letting go is probably the most difficult practice in the spiritual journey. And we don't even know what it is until you've struggled a long time and made many mistakes. And it really means letting go. Here I am. Whatever you say. It's a surrender that is increasingly total. And it involves in the beginning this open-handed attitude of letting go of all our particular impressions, thoughts during the parameters of our time of prayer, which is usually half an hour or so, or longer. Twice a day is often recommended in order to keep the reservoir of interior silence always at a high level. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, our morning prayer may have been pretty well drained by trying to cope with the ups and downs of the rest of the day. In any case, the attitude of surrender to God is the basic disposition in this prayer. And it's concretized in consenting to His presence, which is a specifically human activity, and more specifically, it's the activity of true love. Not romance only. True love is self-surrender. If that isn't present, it's not true love. Now, to open to God will take us several years to really establish that openness. When we are adept at letting go of every particular thought, then our open-handedness is also able to receive, because the same gesture of opening is the gesture of receiving, is it not? So now, as the divine light, life and love is poured into us in ever increasing portions, because there's more space, more room, if you want to be spatial about this thing, at least the free flow of energy is now greatly rectified by the unloading of the unconscious day by day, which is part of the dynamic of centering prayer and the contemplative dimension of the gospel. Then surrender comes into focus. Transformation is something we can't do a thing about, except agree to it. It is wholly the work of the divine message, light, gift. But what we can do is let go and consent, especially in the time of prayer. And then this perspective on reality enables us to make that kind of judgment in active life which knows when to accept a situation and when to do something about it. These are not quite the same thing. We usually want to do something about reality if it's painful. The first thing we should do is accept the fact that it is. Then you decide what to do with it. But that kind of spiritual poise takes a little time to develop. And so here's an example of the disposition of trust. And this is really what is meant, I think, or one way of expressing what faith in Jesus really means from the point of view of content, action in the gospel. This is a story about a fire. This family home is being demolished, a 2-story house, and everybody successfully gets out except this youngster, maybe 8 or 9, who is trapped in the upstairs room. And he can't go back, he can't get out of the house, and now it's too late for the distraught father or mother to get into the house to rescue him. So they go to the window under which they go to the place under his window and look up frantically, and they can see his silhouette against the flames behind him, which are gradually getting closer and closer. And so he climbs out on the windowsill, screaming, "Help!" And he calls out, "Daddy, Daddy, help, save me." And his father calls up to him and says, "Jump! I'll catch you." And this youngster looks down, and he can, the smoke is in his eyes, and there's a smoke screen below. He can't see his father, so he doesn't know where to jump. And so he cries out in desperation, "But Daddy, I can't jump. I can't see you." And his daddy yells up, "But I see you. Jump." And so, gathering up his courage and feeling the flames licking at his back, closes his eyes and steps off the windowsill into space. Of course, the father catches him in his arms, and he's perfectly safe. There's no danger of his ever missing him. But notice that that's a parable of our bodily life. Our house is burning down. Our bodily energy is being consumed. You can't go back in the house for salvation. What's the choice? And yet, we delay on the windowsill. When, if we just stepped out, there's no danger that this God of ours will miss the catch. And so in our centering prayer, this is the attitude that we are assuming. We're letting go of our false self, our defenses, our self-image, our worldview for this specific time. It's a discipline, and yet at the same time, it's a way of deepening our relationship, our capacity to listen, or our capacity to see with the eyes of faith. And as that wonderful disposition of trust grows, then whatever turns up from the unconscious is not going to bother us too much, and our psychological state, whether it is consoled or desolate or anguished or peaceful, is simply part of the interior dialogue that we ignore, or part of the evacuation process that we allow to happen. When you're sick to your stomach because you didn't digest lunch, nothing is better than a good vomit. Nothing. Then you'll feel great. It's a little unpleasant as it comes up, but afterwards you feel great. Similarly, the unloading of the unconscious, our psychological evacuation process, is very uncomfortable as it emerges. But the fact that it passes through your awareness means it's on the way out, it's gone forever. And that means you have more space to enter, for God to enter with his light, life, and love. And so to learn how to put up with that unloading process is great wisdom indeed. You could hardly spend your time any better, even though while it's happening, you think it's the end of the world. It isn't. It's simply the healing process. And it's facilitating our growth. With that idea then, let us, when we enter into centering prayer, consent to God's presence and surrender our entire perceptive apparatus into this process of unknowing, so that the knowledge and perception of the true self may rise into consciousness, and we can begin to live out of that presence rather than out of the narrow, confined straitjacket of the false self with its programs for happiness that can't possibly work.